Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking our time to attend this webinar. My name is Geraldine Mugumia. I work at NITA as a risk analyst, and I would like to invite our moderator for this session, Ms. Diana Agaba. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Geraldine. Good morning, everyone. We are very happy and excited that you could make time and join us today as we discuss a very interesting topic, embedding security and data privacy at the heart of digital transformation. Yes, my name is Diana Agaba Tukundane. I am a member of IS2 Squared Uganda chapter. This is a non-governmental organization that does issue security training with its prominent certificate of CISSP. So you're most welcome. Today, it's a continuation of the campaign that is going on from NITA. NITA-U is holding this year an e-government excellence awards under the theme Bold Digital Government, Embracing Disruptive Technologies. The main drive of this awards is to highlight the advancement in e-government services in Uganda. And the awards activities include the e-government masterclasses. The classes create a platform to share experiences and bring together all players, as you'll see on this panel today, to reflect on the current and the future state of the e-services that the government has to offer. So today we shall be discussing embedding personal and data security and privacy at the heart of digital transformation. Welcome with me our participants, most welcome, and feel free to send in your questions in the Q&A section. But on the other note, please join me in welcoming our panelists today. Stella Alibatesi from the Personal Data and Protection Office. We have Hakius Bizuri from Ernst & Young Uganda, and then Silva Kayondo from Otis Africa, and Robert Chirunda from Chirunda Wesige and Advocates. You're most welcome, panelists. And I'll quickly dive into our session today. And today we cannot talk about digital transformation without mentioning security and personal data security and privacy. And we have seen Uganda within Africa or East Africa take a lead in making sure that we both have a law and a regulation on personal data protection and privacy. And the law is quite new. I think Stella will agree with us that there's still more of awareness that needs to be done. And this law is new for many, and yet it raises obligations to all organizations, small and big, provided you handle personal data. You ought to know what this law entails, and even us as individuals to know the rights that we have as users. So Stella, as the regulator, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for the recent milestone of 100 days in office. I believe you have already a big story to tell, but how would you advise organizations to cope with the law, and also us users to exercise our rights, and what should we expect from the regulator going forward?
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, and I thank NITA for organizing these very important conversations that we need to have. Diana, as you rightly stated, the Data Protection and Privacy Act is a new law, fairly new. It was passed in 2019, and its regulations were only completed in March 2021. It's very important for us, first of all, to understand what the law requires of us and what rights it gives us. As you rightly stated, the issue of creating awareness is very important, and it is something that we've embarked on as an office, especially within our first 100 days. Such conversations also help us to create the much needed awareness on this law, its existence, and its obligations. Now, you asked me how organizations can comply with the law. The law provides for 7 principles that every organization that collects, processes, uses, or holds personal data must comply with. Before I proceed, maybe for those participants who may not know, this law only covers issues related to personal data or personal information. And this is information that can identify you as an individual. Things like your name, your date of birth, your email address, your IP address, anything that can identify you, or a collection of data that can together be used to identify you, can be deemed to be personal information. The law requires organizations that collect this personal information to comply with certain obligations that are provided for. And because of the limited time, I'll dwell on the principles that are provided for under the Act. These principles are global principles, so it's not only Uganda. You'll find them across Africa. Right now, we have about 50% of the African countries have passed data protection and privacy laws. You'll find them in Asia, you'll find them in Europe. So wherever you go, you'll find these data protection principles. The wording may change, but the intent is the same. So the first principle is that you must be accountable to the data subject. This means that when you collect my personal information, you have to have certain measures in place within your organization that detail why you're collecting this information, how you're going to use this information, how you're going to store this information, how you'll secure this information. Are you training your staff? Do you have a data protection and privacy framework within your organization? I should be able, when I ask, to see that this organization is actually complying with the law, and they are utilizing my information, my personal information, for those purposes that they declared. So accountability requires an organization to demonstrate compliance with these laws. It will be very difficult for you to demonstrate compliance if you do not have policies, if you do not have procedures. When you have these policies, you should also show that that you're actually complying with them. If it requires you to, for instance, train your staff, as an office, when we come to audit, we should be able to see that you've trained your staff. When we interact with your staff, we need to know that they need to demonstrate knowledge of data protection matters and the like. Of course, you also have to put in mechanisms or procedures that allow data subjects, and those are the individuals from whom you collect personal information, that when they have a complaint, they know where to address this complaint, and you give them the timelines within which you're going to be able to respond, that you've appointed a data protection officer, and things like that. The second principle is that you must collect personal information fairly and lawfully. Fairly means that when you collect this information, you have informed me why you're collecting this information, and you use it for that purpose. And the purpose is either through a lawful mandate, or we have a contract that requires you to collect this information, or you've obtained my consent if you do not have any other reason to collect my information. And of course, it requires that whatever even if you do a processing, that processing has to be compatible with the purpose that you disclose to me. The other principle I'd like to talk about is the principle of minimality. You only collect what you need and nothing more. It has to be relevant to your purpose. It should not be unnecessary. So organizations have to think through this information that we are collecting. We have maybe 10 fields. do we actually need all these 10 fields? Can we achieve our purpose with, let's say, 3 or 4 fields? So organizations have to think about it. We have to remember that the more information you collect, the more responsibility that you have towards securing that information and towards ensuring that you comply with the law. The other aspect is retention. How long do you retain this information? As an organization, you have to think about all these issues because you'll be required to disclose them to the data subjects. The issue of transparency is very important and enabling the participation of the data subject. This means you give them as much information as they need to be able to make an informed decision about their data. These laws provide for they provide for control over our personal information. So whatever you're doing with my personal information, I should know about it. You have to ensure that the purpose that you disclose is actually how you're utilizing this information. The other aspect is security. And I'm glad this webinar is really going to talk about security and data protection, because you cannot have data protection without security. And I hope our panelists here will talk about things like privacy by design, what standards are there that we can be able to comply with to ensure that when we collect this information, we actually use it and secure it as is expected of us. We have the principle of quality. You must ensure the quality of the information you keep. It's important that as much as possible, let's collect this information from the individual, because I know my details. I'm the best person to give you those details. Within our systems, let's also provide for corrections, how to enable corrections and things like that. So if you remember anything about this law, if you are an organization that is collecting, processing, using, or holding personal data, my recommendation would be to have a detailed understanding of these 7 principles. That way, for whatever decision you're doing, for whatever application you're developing, whatever system you're rolling out, you always ask yourself, how are we complying with these 7 principles? If we do that, compliance with this law will be very easy for us. Thank you, Diana.
Wow, thank you, Stella, for breaking it down as simply as that in terms of the 7 principles that each organization should really have as their stepping stone as they journey or start their journey into personal data protection. But you mentioned at the very tail end how security comes in the picture and how you cannot have privacy without security. So Hercules, with the ongoing blazing of digital transformation speed in the region and Uganda, and we know that COVID hasn't helped, it has really accelerated how organizations are embracing digital to ensure that they can, give their customers services that they would have ideally given in a physical location. What are the topmost security risks that organizations should be thinking about as they start this journey of protecting personal data and, adhering to the laws and regulations that have been put in place?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Diana. Thanks for the warm welcome. And Stella, thanks for the good intro and giving the context in terms of our engagement today. I also just want to thank the panelists that are embracing us today on this subject. And so I've seen a number of participants are still coming in. So Diana, over to you. Probably what I would do, if you don't mind, I can just talk through one slide, which we can help us to frame this conversation, if that's okay with you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm assuming you can see my screen, right?
Yes, it is visible.
Thank you very much. So I think what I wanted to say today is that for sure, when we're discussing with a number of organizations in East Africa, they're going through a number of digital transformation journeys. But of course, before we start talking about the risks, I think we need to understand what are some of the drivers from a cybersecurity perspective that actually have an impact, and then derive into the 10 risks I think that you've asked. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is we need to think about cybersecurity and privacy budgets. And it's very pivotal right now, because whenever there's this digital transformation spending, so there's a proportionality in terms of how much you spend and the ultimate results of the cybersecurity and privacy protection that you get. So I'm going to talk about that in terms of some of the insights that we're getting in that area. The second part, I think, is just to understand that at this present moment in time, there's a lot of talent pressure around cybersecurity, be it privacy, be it cybersecurity itself. And still, of course, mention about the 7 principles, but who's going to be doing that work? Do we have the talent? And that's one of the key things that we need to think about. The third part is regulatory compliance, which is fragmented. Of course, we've got Data Protection and Privacy Act, but I think what I'm going to talk about is some other things that we need to think about in our area, which actually present a number of risks in that space as well. Then, of course, with all that is changing, how is cybersecurity relationships being managed within an enterprise? And if they're not managed correctly, I think what we tend to see is that we have got, of course, other risks that actually come through. And then finally, COVID-19, I think, is just a disruptor on everything that we're looking at. And someone could have even said that it's actually fueling digital transformation at the moment by reaction or by response, if you like. So I would look at, from my perspective, these are not necessarily the views of EY, but this is what I'm seeing when I'm engaging with my clients in terms of what are those drivers. So I'll then now talk to or speak to those 10 risks that I'm seeing now that are actually having an impact, which I view probably could be the top 10 risks that we need to think about. The first part is that when we're looking at cybersecurity, I think with digital transformation, I do look at the budgets, and they're quite significant. But of course, proportionally to prioritization and funding of cybersecurity, even on our own EY Global Information Security Survey, you find that the budgets that are for protection and response to cybersecurity threats, they are still very low. So the cybersecurity programs most of the time are underfunded. So it now becomes a downstream, or has a downstream effect in as far as the risks that you're looking at. So I look at budget as one of the issues, which I think comes prominent in most organizations. The second risk that we are seeing now is largely around third-party risks. So with digital transformation, I think right now, in terms of acceleration, what we are seeing is that we have to create new ecosystems. So for those in the financial services, you would understand that the ecosystem is quite complex right now. And when I look at it, there's always what we call the left-hand side and the right-hand side. The left-hand side, for me, tends to be the Bank of Uganda regulated framework for integration and interoperability. I think it's really structured, for example, for those RTGS, EFT type of payments. But when you look at the right-hand side for me, which is like your fintechs, your NITAs and the rest, there's a lot of bilateral arrangements that are there, which I think generates a lot of risks around how that ecosystem is designed. But because of the business models now right now being driven by digital transformation and COVID-19, what we're also seeing that we're also seeing supply chain risk, because the business models are actually dependent on other business models, and cybersecurity is also be embedded in that. So how do you manage those risks from a cybersec? Where are your boundaries? And I think it's becoming more complex in the sense that you cannot really measure the security factor for your own organization. So this is what I see most organizations dealing with. And of course, I think the third part comes to response to exponential attacks. I think this is also tied to budget, but also what we are seeing is that there's an exponential growth year on year of the cyber attacks that we are seeing within organizations. So again, when you've got a low budget or a weak budget, it's very difficult to be able to manage that. Even where you have invested is just exponentially high. So organizations now need to think differently around how they manage those what I would call risks. Then, of course, I think training and awareness, it always is a basic area that comes in terms of how do you educate your teams to manage those risks. And most of the threats that we are seeing in terms of risks, I think most of them are internally propagated, either through social engineering mechanisms or just blatantly poor awareness. And I would consider that as one of the key risks I think we also need to think about as organizations, especially on digital transformation. So the question is, how do you ensure that at least that the learning methodology of your organization is tied to the transformation you are having as an organization, and with cyber at the center? I think the other part I think that's also very key is how are we dealing with adoption of industry frameworks, standards, and what comes to mind is an element of standardization. How are you growing or maturing within your security journey? And most of the time, we tend to have blind spots in terms of our environment because we're not working within a framework. So most organizations, probably in terms of maturity, we tend to see them emerging or developing, but they're not necessarily yet there. And that actually presents a big risk. And I think when we complement this with ecosystem, I think that's when we tend to see, I think, an exponential growth in terms of how we do. So standardization of those and adoption of frameworks, I think, is one of the areas that we need to think about. And Stella, I am happy you talked about the data protection and privacy. But from where I'm sitting from a cyber security, and I'll talk in terms of regulatory pressure, I think if you look at the cybersecurity professional nowadays, I think there's really fragmentation in terms of compliance. There's the Data Protection and Privacy Act, which I think we're all aware of. But remember, since 2011, we've passed a number of laws, electronic transaction, digital signature, and many others, right? If you're in the financial services, you're also dealing with the National Payment Systems or Services Act, right? Which I think now, if you're a payment service provider, being it a bank or a fintech, you have to comply with it. On top of that, if you've got operations outside Uganda, you also need to think the GDPR. How do you comply with that? And right now I'm talking to my colleagues in the banks, and there's a SWIFT program where they're supposed to comply with by 31st December. Not to mention the mandatory BOU audits, the AML reviews that ongoing. So all those are sitting within the cybersecurity teams. And what regulatory compliance mechanisms do we put in place to make sure that at least we do not have a regulatory compliance risk? I think that's one factor probably we need to think about from a risk. Then, of course, what I'm seeing also interesting in the market is that we have talent war. And that talent war is actually coming about because we don't have the right cyber skills. Type of talent war that we are dealing with, I think it's a bit of a challenge. And then, of course, what we are also seeing is that how are we engaging our cyber teams in terms of initiatives and projects? And I liked Stella talking about privacy by design. But what we are seeing is that our security professionals currently are being included in projects normally at the design, not at the planning stage. And a recent survey tells us that we're looking at about 46% or having that involvement around the design, which is the highest. But most of the time, it's between 0 probably to 10% on the planning. And that actually affects the digital transformation journey because you're not engaging them. Again, on the strategic initiatives, the information security professionals are not included on the strategic framework in terms of design, all those digital transformation projects. They probably are informed, but they're not at the center of the design. And that actually affects or impacts the risk in terms of security by design as a principle. I think personally what I've seen is that architectures and legacy systems are a big problem at the moment. And as we are moving on this digital journey, we are retaining some of those old solutions which have known vulnerabilities, but also we've seen a monolithic nature in terms of orchestrations of services, particularly when I talk about integrations within probably financial services, even government. So we don't have a common framework at a national level to be able to deal with all these issues that I've talked about. And the risks and the vectors currently are unknown and probably undefined. And this is probably one of the issues we need to think about as organizations and also monitor. And then, of course, I think finally, to me, COVID-19 has presented other risks to the organizations working from anywhere. We also now need to change business models to be able to adapt to COVID-19. So what I've seen with most organizations, whilst the attempt is there, but the curve is actually moving faster than our security response programs that we need to think about. So I think at a snapshot or in a nutshell, this probably would what I would think as the top 10 risks that I'm seeing here is about my perspective from my understanding of Uganda and the region. So Diana, that's probably a short from myself. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Hakus. I think it's been quite, telling and covering the entire spectrum. And I think as we go along, we shall come back to this discussion. Because when you bring COVID-19 into the picture and then you say you need cyber budget, you get to board and they say, we are making half what we used to make. Where do you want us to get that budget? So how do you then get them to appreciate that if they don't even put cyber budget in place, they could lose the little that they are holding on to? So I'm hoping that we'll have questions that will come from our attendees around how do you merge those two conflicting needs or requirements for someone to be able to have a solid digital transformation journey. Moving on to Robert, and also building on what we've just had, digital transformation by its nature is borderless. And there was talk about, I think Stella talked about over 50 countries already having their own laws. We have GDPR that I think was the beginning of, started this talk about privacy. So organization can easily offer service with this borderless working to be accessed across many countries. And at the same time, countries are increasingly adopting privacy-related laws. So how do you advise organizations on how best to meet these several regulatory compliance requirements? And which one do they prioritize, their own or the one in which they are now conducting business? How do you advise organizations with the multitude of laws that they have to adhere to?
Thank you, Diana, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I salute my colleagues on the panel who have spoken before me and my brother Silva. Always a joy to share these spaces and to share my 2 cents. Stella and Hercules have actually sort of delivered half of my conversation this morning. I'm just going to build on that excellent foundation. So for those with whom I have not had the privilege of meeting, my name is Robert Chirunda. I teach and practice law, so a lot of what I say is going to be skewed towards the law, but I hope that when I say technical things, they might make sense as well. To answer your question, Diana, when we advise global companies, we counsel them to take a twin culture approach, and that is building a culture towards data privacy compliance. As Stella eloquently put it, most countries have laws. And so the first thing we advise our clients is just understand that you have to comply. Don't try to find a way around the legislation. Don't try to find a way around the issues that may come with compliance, or the tasks or the budget or the points that Hercules has been talking about from a practical perspective. And that means that if you're leaving Uganda going to Kenya, you need, first of all, to understand your local law, because like Stella correctly said, the principles, the foundational principles are the same. So if you understand and comply with your local legislation, complying across borders is going to be easy. At least you will have started somewhere and you're not entering a foray. Some laws are more advanced than others. Indeed, as you've pointed out, GDPR is far more detailed than many legislations, but it's always a good start to have where you start. So have local counsel and understand your local legislation, comply with it. The second step, of course, is as you select your jurisdictions to go to, seek local counsel there, because in the end, all laws are local. Ugandan law will not apply to Tanzania. Tanzanian law might have slightly more detail than Ugandan legislation. So the first obvious thing you want to do is retain Tanzanian counsel who can walk you through how different or how similar these laws are. Those of us in private practice know that one of the things that happens to us the most is people giving us checklists and saying, does your law cover this? Does your law cover that? If I were advising a client going out of Uganda, I would say, don't get outside counsel to send a checklist. Get local counsel because they would have more nuanced understanding of the law. The third, of course, is general global trends, and you mentioned GDPR, so I wouldn't labor on that. And the fourth would be the global design principles that Stella talked about. But then beyond that, there's so I mentioned the twin culture approach. That's the first side of the approach. The second is really a tech-oriented compliance culture. And that's where we now go to privacy by design, which both Stella and Hercules have mentioned. So what does that really mean? You have, I'm going to come back to the 7 principles, but what we encourage our clients to do is, or what we encourage companies to do is, know and inculcate the privacy audits, find local partners with whom you can do this and who understand the local requirements of each of these jurisdictions that you intend to get into. So what are these, what is privacy by design? Really, as the term suggests, this is data protection through technology design. And behind this is the thought that data protection in data processing procedures are best adhered to when they are already integrated or embedded in the technology as it is created. So that way you secure by design the data that is entering your system. There are 7 core principles, and just to run through them briefly, the first is be proactive, not reactive, be preventive, not remedial. And that means, on the one hand, that you're going to have a clear commitment at the highest level of your organization and set and enforce high standards of privacy, generally higher than the standards that are set out in global laws and regulations, because only you understand the architecture of the system you're building better than anyone else. The second is you'll have a privacy commitment that is demonstrably shared throughout by user communities. In many of the emerging technology spaces, especially, one builds a company and then around that company grows a whole ecosystem or a number of ecosystems. If you take Jumia, for instance, you have the logistics, you have the mall, as they call it, and then you have the financing side, and each of those ecosystems will give rise to its own data issues. And one needs to make sure that there's a commitment, a privacy commitment across those communities. The third in the first principle is establishing methods to recognize poor privacy design and anticipate privacy practices and outcomes, and therefore to correct any negative impacts as soon as they are detected. The second of the foundational principles is privacy is set as a default setting. And this basically means that you ensure that personal data are automatically protected in any system or in any business practice. And so individuals don't have to protect their own data because the system was created to be secure. If people want to take their steps to secure their own data, then they can, but making privacy by default simplifies it in the sense that they don't have to worry too much. This is why I have always enjoyed looking at the comparison between what was the traditional Apple stand versus the traditional Google stand on privacy and data collection and protection. Although I do understand that, in some ways you're stepping out of the traditional personal data, as Stella correctly drew the distinction. The third foundational principle, and I'm rushing through it because I know that time is not our best friend, as always, but the third principle is privacy embedded into design. Now here you basically have the architecture of the IT system itself and the business practices engendering a privacy approach. So privacy is not bolted onto the system as an add-on or after the fact. And the result is that privacy becomes an essential component of the core functionality that is being achieved. So privacy is integral to the system without diminishing functionality. That is so critical because in the end, it takes us to the fourth foundational principle, which is you have full functionality. It is positive sum, not zero sum. So we used to have these trade-offs where people have built systems where they say, look, you either have privacy or functionality. One doesn't have to have a dichotomy. One can build a system that's easy, that ensures that you have privacy as well as security, as well as functionality from the very beginning, because it's like building a house. You design it, you draw the architectural plans, and then you put the bricks. So it's not like you're starting to shift the bricks on the rooms as you build, but you can take on a win-win situation where in the very core elements, and this is why the point that Hercules made about including designers and privacy persons in the room to think through the architecture of the system becomes really critical. And that's where ideally we should all be aspiring to go. And that will lead us to the fifth pillar, which is having an end-to-end security. In other words, you have a full life cycle protection. So privacy by design considers security from start to finish. This means that the information is secure and protected. When it enters the system, it is retained safely and then properly destroyed. So having embedded into the system privacy prior to the first element of information being collected, it helps to extend security throughout the entire life cycle of the data involved. So you have strong security measures, and these are essential from the very beginning all the way to the end, such that you're sort of taking a cradle to the grave approach, if you will, such that throughout the life cycle of managing information, using this information, even if you have to repurpose it, it is being repurposed within a system that is built to be secure and yet to engender privacy. And then the sixth principle, therefore, is enabling visibility and transparency. So keep the system open, allowing users and other involved parties to see how information moves through your system is actually a good thing because it helps with accountability, openness, and compliance, which are required for an effective and secure system to move and comply within a particular legal framework. So privacy by design then seeks to assure all stakeholders that whatever the business practices or technology involved, it is in fact operating according to stated promises and objectives and subject to independent verification. So its component parts then operationalize and remain visible and transparent to both users and providers alike. And like the Americans say, we trust the system, but we always want to verify. And then finally, the seventh principle is that the system should have respect for user privacy, keep it user-centric. In the end, the world is emphasizing moving away from building systems that focus on what it is that we want to maximize. Maybe you're building a business that's data-centric and the data is the fuel, the data is the engine that you want to profit from. But at the end of the day, one has to put users over profit and to make sure that user privacy is a number one concern, and you're dealing with customers' private information. The stakes are really, really high, and letting it fall into the wrong hands can be extremely dangerous. And more generally, therefore, your system should be optimized for users and for all their needs. So how do you achieve this? We recommend having, first of all, apart from the architecture itself, working with people locally who understand the law and the tech side of compliance, such that as you're building through, they can come in. If you have built the system, first of all, if you're going to a new market, you're going to take your system apart, you're going to look through what compliance in another country will mean, and then you're going to embed privacy as you build or as you customize. You want to do this regularly and often because systems improve, systems change as markets are dynamic. You want to be able to do this regularly and often, but also it helps to have certifications. Stella mentioned them, and I think there are different kinds of certification out there. the Standards Council of Canada has its own set. I think the most universal would probably be ISO PC 317, which is the ISO standard of motion protection and privacy by design for consumer goods and services. But there will also be self-regulatory approaches to privacy by design. And these have come out of different people and different institutions building on standards that they deem to be appropriate for securing privacy. And so you will have, for instance, in some contexts, a three-step process. You want to have a third party coming in, and you're going to subject yourself to an application process where they're going to come in, they're going to respond to assessments and recommendations, and they're going to assess your system. They're going to give you recommendations, and they're going to certify that you've met these various standards that we're talking about. So depending on which standard you pick, whether it's the ISO standard or it's one of these private self-regulatory standards, of which there are many, the OECD has some, and APEC privacy framework also provides some. Really, the goal is that one has to have the cultural mindset to know that privacy will not be something you suggest to your users to adopt. It is something that you build into the system for them to know and to be comfortable with, but at the same time to know that it's not just playing fast fiddle to the principles, it's actually building in the system. And I'll leave it at that for now, Diana. Thank you.
Wow, Robert, if I didn't hear you introduce yourself, I would, pass you for more of a techie than a lawyer, but I think you've done great in trying to marry what Stella started with in terms of principle into security that Achilles did touch on, and you have had an emphasis on privacy by design. So I hear at the very beginning we have privacy by design, security by design, but also functionality, and how do we marry all the three to ensure that at the end of the day we are compliant as an organization. And I think we shall come back to that because being someone who is in the field, when Hakiri said 46% of security is being brought on at design stage, and I wanted to say, no. My experience has shown me that they only remember us at testing, the final stages. So we are just more of a build on rather than being infused in the systems. Moving on, we could hear from Silva in terms of law on privacy are new, like we have all been saying, to most countries. And much as ours was, the Data Protection Act was, put in place in 2019, we only came to start operationalizing it in 2021. So as such, awareness is only increasing, and not many of us, either as users or as organizations, are aware of these laws and regulations. But that has not stopped innovation. Innovation is still happening, and even happening at a faster rate than before, like we said, because of what COVID has done to all of us. So what's your take on how entrepreneurs can balance compliance with privacy laws and innovation?
All right, thank you, Dana. Yeah, I think I'll turn off my screen because my connectivity isn't the best this side. So, but that's how I look like, just for the benefit of the other participants online.
Right.
So, what are we seeing? One is, where is innovation happening? Innovation, of course, is happening in-house in the corporate world. I mean, we've seen the big corporates, some of them even launching their own innovation and incubation hubs. We're seeing also innovation happening in startups. Those are everywhere. They are online, they're in garages, they're in incubation and accelerator hubs, etc. We are also seeing innovation happening in government. I mean, you're seeing a lot of URA with these fiscal receipts, e-invoicing, use of drones, Riponami, etc. You're seeing a lot of innovation at URSB as well. and other entities. I mean, you're seeing a lot at NITA, for instance, as well. However, these type of government agencies have some separate characteristics because of their law enforcement mandate, which is one of the exceptions under the Data Protection and Privacy Act in terms of compliance. So what is spurring innovation is largely convenience. And this particular has been seen in the payments, utilities, online deliveries, etc. And so this has posed the question that are we willing to trade off, say, convenience for privacy in some instances? And you'll find a very bigger picture around such kind of functionality. So I talked about those innovation spaces, that's the corporates, the startups, and government, because each of these has a very different risk profile. I could tell you, for example, you'll find like in terms of startup risks in innovation, is that most of our startups start really, really small and they go on expanding and growing. However, because of the budget constraints that Hercules talked about, you'll find that they did not plug the gaps they had when they were really, really small. So as a founder, you get really obsessed with the growth that's happening and you fail to plug these gaps. So when you do systems integration with larger players, such as financial institutions, then those vulnerabilities are also embedded in those integration systems. And we've seen this not only at systems integrations, but also with some mergers and acquisitions. So when large corporates say acquire some smaller startups, you will have to find that some of those vulnerabilities are adopted into those systems. So we've started seeing as a risk mitigation measure that before you're merging or acquiring or systems integration is occurring, we have to do sort of IT audits, but also part of the due diligence checklist now includes security, data security, and privacy risks, which to me is a very good development in the market. Then we are also seeing, of course, with the enactment of the Act in the innovation space, we are seeing a lot of uptake of policies, mostly data protection, cookies policies, and data retention policies. However, the challenge we are facing with that is that because most startups may not be able to afford professionals, they are just downloading templates and precedents offline. Sometimes they will not customize those adequately, like to Ugandan situations. So you'll find a policy telling you in case of a dispute, it will be resolved in Delaware. And you're like, okay, this is how is this really going to play out? So we're encouraging the startups, for instance, we are working with in incubators and accelerators to sort of have we are tailoring budget packages, startup packages for such kind of services as an extension of accelerator or incubation hub services. And this, of course, goes ahead with developing their data governance frameworks. And those data governance frameworks drill down even to aspects such as metadata, data warehousing, and things like that. And of course, talking of standardization, it's very positive that NITA has indicated that the Personal Data Protection Office has indicated to us that the ISO 27701, which is a personal information management system certification standard, will be recognized. I'm cognizant of time. I think maybe I'll give an opportunity for questions. Then I think we will add more value when people ask us specific questions, then we can ask. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Silva. Yes, it was brief, but still insightful in terms of how do we ensure that innovation is not far ahead of privacy and security in organizations. Attendees, please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A so that this great panel can, give us, continue to share their words of wisdom. But as I wait on the Q&A and as the discussions were going on, I formulated some of the questions, and I'll just ask any panelist who feels ready to answer. When Stella was talking about the 7 principles, it feels like a good starting point. And organizations will be like, yes, now I have the 7 principles. I know I need to find a way of adhering and complying, but where do I start? We know that there's a requirement, for example, for organizations to have a data protection officer. Is that the starting point? You talked about having a custom data protection framework within the organization. Do they need to start from scratch? Are there standards that they can just, without reinventing the wheel, frameworks that are already in existing that organizations can benchmark on? But to sum it up, what are those 2-3 things that you'd say an organization or a representative on this call to take away and say, this, if you started here, you'd be on the right journey to complying to both data privacy, but also ensuring that you're embedding security in what you do?
Yeah, thank you, Diana. Can I start?
Please.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the excellent panelists that have talked about this, the topic we are discussing in detail. We can see the wealth of knowledge that we have in Uganda. And I hope that with that knowledge, they'll also keep talking about these issues. I know my land friends, Robert and Silva, are very active on social media, and I urge them to continue this conversation. In terms of compliance, on our side as the Personal Data Protection Office, some of the things we are recommending are: 1, appoint or designate a data protection officer. The law does not, it's not mandatory for you to have a data protection officer, save for certain categories of organizations. However, our recommendation is that all organizations designate a data protection officer. You'll note the law requires designation, and that was deliberate to address issues where organizations are not able to afford. Silva has already talked about the organizations in the innovation space who may not necessarily have the funding that can enable them appoint a data protection officer. What we've seen in organizations that are already complying is that organizations are engaging or designating already existing officers to look into issues of data protection. And these can be lawyers, compliance professionals, security professionals. So as long as someone can understand the law, has the mindset, to develop their skills in this area, it's important that when you have this person, they will help you understand and implement. The purpose for a data protection officer is that you'll have a focal point. Someone who on a daily basis will try to find out, how do we do this? How do we comply? What do we need to put in place? Because it's important that people catch up fast. As you indicated, yes, the law was passed in 2019, but this law has no transition clause, which means it started applying immediately. So if you have someone who can be able to walk this journey with you, to provide focus on data protection, I think that makes it easier. Secondly, for us as an office, whenever we are working a lot with these data protection officers, we've already done a webinar addressed to data protection officers. Recently in November, in collaboration with Unwanted Witness, which is a civil society organization. We also did training for data protection officers, and we are going to continue doing that training. The purpose for that is to have them as our champions within these organizations, to give them more information than maybe someone at the reception may know about data protection. And then we want them to implement the measures that will be recommended by the office within the organization. So number one, please designate a data protection officer in your organization. The second action you can take is to register with the office. This is mandatory, it's a requirement of the law. However, when you go through that registration process, it starts you on that journey to compliance, because the form is very elaborate. It will ask you what kind of personal information are you collecting? And normally the mistake is that people quickly take this to IT. And this is not an IT issue only. It covers HR, it covers your businesses, it covers your marketing arm, it covers your security team, it covers the entire organization. You'll be very surprised when you ask the question within maybe your management team, do you collect any personal information? The CEO will not know who is collecting personal information within the organization. So when you register, that process of registration enables you to go through some of those things. There are certain questions that you must answer as you fill in that form. The purpose for the collection, retention periods, what security measures you have in place. It's a comprehensive form. So once you register, it's also part of that process. The other advantage of registering with the office is that we know who you are, and we are able to provide you support. For instance, we've purposed that every month, in the last week of the month, the last Wednesday of the month, we do webinars on different topics. And some of the speakers here, like Hercules, have spoken on those webinars. It's very important for you to be part of that forum so that you can get as much information as you need. Lastly, because of time, the importance of a data governance framework is very important. Of course, Silver made it wider, which is a good thing. But for us as an office, we are focusing on data protection and privacy frameworks. If you go through that process, compliance will be very easy for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. And I like that you ended on the framework. I know from an information security point of view, NITA-U has an information security framework that organizations can benchmark on to have a framework internally. Are we seeing a data protection framework for Uganda specifically coming through to help organizations benchmark on the same?
Yes, Diana. As an office, we know, first of all, we are very few in the office. So we've agreed that as much as possible, we shall provide templates, checklist, guidance notes, and upload them on our website so that those who need that information are able to get that information. So my recommendation would be, once we are not yet, we haven't yet issued that framework or guidance on data protection and privacy frameworks, but it will come in time.
Right, thank you. I think I'll just have one or two questions as we wind up. And Hercules, I packed a question for you on how do we marry COVID and budget, and how do you sell the story of cyber to board and tell them, because for organizations that have not had an incident, it's either you're benchmarking on another incident and telling them, if you don't do this, then this is the repercussion. How do you advise organizations to go around, strategically having a buy-in and having the cyber budget that is needed to put security in place that will enable privacy to be taken care of? Because I know here we are talking privacy and security in the same sentence, but they're quite distinct, and though they can't live in isolation.
Thanks, Diana, for that question. Probably what I'll say is what we are seeing currently is that when we talk about probably the top 3 risks, cyber comes to mind. And the conversation now has shifted to the boardroom, in the sense that in terms of digital literacy, not only digital transformation, I think cybersecurity now has become a board matter. So I think when we're talking about governance at that level, what we need to make sure is that how are we defining cybersecurity matters as part of boards, and how can the board of directors actually appreciate the risks that actually come with cybersecurity, reputational risk, financial loss, and many others. I think you can see when we are engaging them, they need to also then understand what those risks translate into dollars and cents. So for example, if there's a breach, what does it mean to an organization? So the question is, are we having those conversations? And remember, I talked about education and awareness. What sort of leadership, what sort of conversations are happening at board level? Then the second layer, which I think is very important, I think then when we talk about our strategic pillars as organizations, how are we embedding cybersecurity as part of the overall business strategy? And especially when you talk about the risk framework of an organization. So when it sits there, then it means that as part of our monitoring in terms of our strategic objectives, there's no way we can avoid any engagement around cybersecurity. So which means it is at executive level, it is at board level. Now, the question now which you are raising is that how do you articulate it? And I think now you need to look at your enterprise risk management framework. Right now, when you're having digital transformation and you're talking about your risk universe, I think the conversation now needs to be unpacked around what sort of risks are we likely to see in our risk universe tied to cybersecurity. Let's start that conversation then. It builds into our enterprise risk management framework. It builds into our BCM, business continuity management framework. And that's how then that conversation is embedded into an organizational-wide discussion. You talked about cyber, about COVID-19, and for sure right now is the same thing. Most of the risks when you talk about resilience on COVID-19, it's how you tell the story and you look at the risks that actually have an impact. And when you start having those conversations and those layers that I talked about, I think the conversations become different. But one of the key things I think I want to conclude by saying is that normally when we are discussing projects, we do not discuss what we call the business case. A cybersecurity project also has a return on investment. So for example, when you are protecting your organization, what sort of savings come in from a reputational perspective? If you can quantify that, that's good. And most organizations and most stakeholders like myself, who is a customer, if I'm interacting with the bank, your brand value grows when I understand how well you're protected as an organization, isn't it? And if you are prone to risk, your brand value goes. So we need to also to build a business case story around cybersecurity, and then you translate it to the layers that I've talked about. So probably that's how I would look at it, Diana. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as we get to the closing, maybe I'll ask Silva and Robert in their remarks. I know Stella called you out in terms of being active social media users, but what stands out is that there's still a lot of awareness that needs to go out, not just for organizations, but for us as data subjects, because we also need to be aware of our rights and how the different organizations that hold our data are protecting it in terms of security and privacy. So how do you advise organizations to go about creating the awareness and also supporting the different organizations that government has put in place, like NITAU, to ensure that across board, enterprise, small enterprise organizations, innovators, and data subjects are aware of the law and how it impacts them as their data is being processed?
Well, personally, I'm always happy with the regulatory sandboxes that are coming up. I know like BOU has one. So this creates very nice live test environments for early stage or solutions, also for ongoing solutions that we need to improve. So I think that's quite a commendable solution. And then there is also, people talk of self-regulation and government regulation, but also we need to strengthen co-regulation. This is in terms of the various associations and bodies, maybe ICT association, FinTech association, bankers association, etc. So once that prefectorship, I don't know if that's a right word, the sort of oversight is happening even at collegial level, peer-to-peer, then we can drive like the compliance we need in terms of encouraging these bodies to list members that are certified so that clients can know people who are aspiring to those standards, or the professionals within the network who have the requisite certification, sort of talent registers, etc. That can help. One of my core areas of interest as well is around emerging trends and third-party risks. Much of the innovation is happening maybe on APIs. These are application programming interfaces, where local solutions are being built on existing systems. Of course, the discussion around the metaverse is going to be really, really big from an innovation perspective, and what that presents for Uganda. So we will probably need to see sort of maybe a basic API standard or something like that, sort of a risk management tool that we can see. And lastly, maybe in terms of the PDP and how we can strengthen further, be really technologically neutral. But that does not, I think, forbid us from drilling down to specifics, because different types of personal data have different risk profiles. Is it health data? Is it location data? Is it financial data? So once pertaining to various sector standards or sector specific interests, then we can drill down. But also different types of technologies have different risk profiles. For instance, I've interacted with virtual reality and augmented reality. I find them the creepiest technologies I've dealt with. These take a whole amount of personal data, from your iris to biometrics to everything, like you need to do a kind of thing. So I also need to think that maybe we could start thinking of mapping and scoping around the intrusiveness of some of these technologies from a personal data perspective, and also sort of deal, because come to think of it, we are mostly a net consumer of these technologies and things like that. Our journey towards full innovation, especially in the hardware space, is really, really, really early stage. So I think as we get into the wider global market, we will see how this pans out and what it everyone evolved. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you. Robert, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana, and to all my colleagues. Excellent presentations. I agree with everything that all three of them have said, especially the last points that Silva made. I'll just add the fact that perhaps I would emphasize ecosystems, thinking in terms of systems instead of silos. And that's important because then we stop looking at individual problems in organizations and start looking at them as systemic and society's problems. Solutions will be easier to achieve. There is also the discussion around agile regulation. And in that space, we've been encouraging cross-pollination of ideas and moves towards regulation. So for instance, if Ministry of ICT is writing a national strategy on 4IR, then it should really be thinking about how regulation is going to cut across sectors, such that you don't have a sandbox discussion in BOU, but not in CMA. And when you're applying to CMA for licenses, you then have to figure out, hang on a second, if I want to test this thing, where do I go? And I think that NITA sort of sits in the middle of all these spaces and can bring all of us together to say, let's start taking this thing apart, as Silva has suggested, unit by unit. If we're looking at a specific kind of technology, can we bring private sector into the room? I think that data and ICTs have finally helped us to break the traditional regulatory approach, which is us versus them, regulators versus users and things like that, to now a point where beyond self-regulation, you can have collaborations across the regulator and the regulated, which is where conversations, I find that they grow better. So embracing agile regulation, embracing synergies and collaborations across ecosystems. Also, the point about emerging trends is a critical one, but as well as thinking through, okay, what do we really want to do? So I'm one of those who's a huge fan of saying that we need to think through our society from where we stand, as opposed to letting the technologies just come. We know companies now that are building USSD for crypto, for example. That's a very local solution, because if you want to take crypto in its complicated nature and bring it down to Uganda. Now think about the data in that space and the issues and the regulation around that and the policies, but also to encourage self-regulation. So to build conversations that encourage people to engender a culture around protecting data and them understanding that it's for us. So I personally am always excited to see organizations like NITA that are happy to talk to the private sector and to say, look, this is a collective responsibility. And I think that's a great way to move forward. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Robert. I know this conversation is quite interesting and we can go on and on the whole day, but I know our time is well spent, but I wouldn't have done myself justice if I didn't, address one of the risks that Haki's mentioned of cyber skill set that is in shortage. Given that I do come from ISC2 squared, that is all about having more people training and embracing cyber security as a career. So you can check us out. We encourage you to do different courses. And I know Haki is on the other side, we have found ourselves in ISACA, which is also another organization that is all about having more skill set within this space. So to the entire panel, we are very grateful for the time that you have given us and the wealth of knowledge that you have shared with our attendees. And to our attendees, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. We hope that you're now ambassadors to the topic that we are talking about, privacy, security, and how this is integrated in innovation to ensure that at the end of the day, we are secure and compliant. I will hand over back to you, Geraldine, for any other additions, but thank you so much and God bless.
Thank you, everyone. Diana, you've said it all, so thank you.